Everyone knows about going over the top. The whistle blows, the ladders go up, and thousands of men climb out of the trenches into machine gun fire together. It's the defining image of the First World War. It's in every documentary, every film, every history textbook. But here's what those documentaries almost never show you. While those mass charges were happening, and in between them, and before them, and after them, every single day of the war, individual men were doing the exact same thing. Climbing out of the trench, crossing no man's land, running through machine gun fire, alone, multiple times a day, to deliver a piece of paper. First World War runners had one of the highest mortality rates of any role in the entire conflict. During major offensives, runner casualties on some sections of the Western Front reached 50 to 80% in a single day. During sustained operations, the average battalion was losing 3 to 5 runners every week. And yet you will find almost no monuments to them, no special recognition, no dedicated chapter in most histories of the war. They were essential to every operation ever conducted on the Western Front, and they have been almost completely erased from the way we remember the conflict. This is the story of what it actually meant to be a First World War runner. And the story is much darker than most people realize. To understand why men were being sent to die carrying pieces of paper, you first have to understand the communications catastrophe that defined the First World War from its opening weeks. The generals who planned World War I had grown up in a military world where the telegraph was the pinnacle of battlefield communication technology. By 1914, wireless radio existed, but only barely, and not in any form that was practically useful on a dynamic battlefield. The radio equipment available at the start of the war required multiple men to carry it, was extraordinarily sensitive to the mud and rain that defined trench warfare, suffered constant interference from the electrical discharge of nearby artillery, and had a range so limited it often could not bridge the distance between frontline trenches and the command posts a mile or two behind them. When a set was not failing from moisture or interference, it was being destroyed by shell fire before the operator could finish transmitting. Telephone lines were strung along the trenches and back through communication trenches to headquarters, and they worked until artillery fire cut them, which happened constantly. A single heavy bombardment could sever dozens of lines at once. Repair crews went out to fix them and were killed by the same shell fire that had cut the lines in the first place. During major engagements, maintaining telephone communication forward of battalion headquarters was essentially impossible. The lines went down faster than they could be repaired. Carrier pigeons were used, and they saved lives. But a pigeon could carry only one small message, and it flew in one direction, took time to prepare, and could be killed. You could not send a pigeon back and forth across no man's land 10 times in a day, requesting artillery support, reporting casualties, adjusting coordinates, and updating command on the tactical situation. The volume of communication a functioning military operation requires was simply beyond what pigeons could handle, which left one option: a man, with a message, on foot. Battalions needed constant communication, tactical updates every time the situation changed, casualty reports, artillery coordination requests, ammunition and supply requests, prisoner intelligence, updated maps, orders coming down from brigade and division. All of it had to move physically, carried by human beings, across ground that was specifically designed to kill human beings. There was no alternative. The technology simply did not exist yet. And so, the runners ran. Now let's talk about what they were actually running through, because this is where the legend, to the extent runners have a legend at all, completely fails to capture reality. A typical runner assignment during a major engagement meant crossing between 200 and 800 yards of open ground, or navigating through communication trenches that were often partially collapsed, flooded, and under intermittent fire. In the open, a runner presented himself as a lone moving target against a landscape that had been stripped of cover by months of shell fire. There were no trees, no buildings, no walls, just churned mud, flooded shell holes, tangles of barbed wire, and the bodies of men who had crossed the same ground before him and had not made it. The German MG-08 machine gun fired between 400 and 500 rounds per minute. A single gunner covering 300 yards of open ground had more than enough ammunition and more than enough time to engage a lone runner. And here is something that most people never consider. German machine gunners were specifically trained to watch for runners, not because of any special directive from high command, but because experienced machine gun crews understood the tactical value of killing them. A runner carried communication. Kill the runner, and you blind the enemy command. You create confusion at exactly the moment when clarity matters most. You force them to send another man, and kill him too, until the message either gets through by sheer attrition, or the situation it describes has already become irrelevant. Snipers understood the same calculus. A sniper who spent an hour waiting for a target could shoot an infantryman in a trench and kill one man, or he could wait for a runner crossing open ground and kill the communication between a forward unit and its command at a critical moment. German snipers specifically prioritized runners as high-value targets. British and French intelligence recovered enough German training material and prisoner testimony during the war to confirm this. Killing runners was not incidental. It was deliberate tactical doctrine. Artillery added a dimension of pure lottery to every crossing. A runner who had successfully navigated sniper fire and machine gun coverage could be obliterated by a shell landing 3 feet to his left that had nothing to do with him specifically. A ranging shot, a random barrage, a battery firing on a schedule set hours before. Shrapnel from near misses shredded exposed runners with no warning and no defense possible. The runner could not hear a shell with his name on it above the general roar of an active battlefield. He just ran and hoped. And then there was the gas. Mustard gas and chlorine settled into low areas, shell holes, depressions in the ground, the natural hollows in no man's land. A runner navigating by the fastest route, jumping from cover to cover, would sometimes land in a shell hole and find himself in a pocket of gas that had pooled there hours ago and had not dissipated. He had to choose between staying low and potentially being gassed, or staying exposed and being shot. If he was wearing his gas mask, which slowed him down, reduced his visibility, and made an already exhausting sprint even more physically demanding, he was a slower target. Slower meant more time exposed. More time exposed meant higher probability of being hit. Just pause for a moment and think about what that actually means. Every variable in the runner's environment was specifically working against him. The machine gunners were trained to kill him. The snipers were waiting for him. The artillery was random and indifferent. The gas settled in exactly the places where a running man would naturally take cover. And the terrain itself, the mud that could swallow a man to his thighs, the barbed wire that caught and held, the flooded shell holes that drowned men who fell into them, turned every crossing into an obstacle course designed to keep him in the killing ground longer than he needed to be. Now let's build the probability picture, because the numbers are where this becomes truly unbearable. The British Army alone sent millions of individual messages via runner over the course of the war. Millions. The exact casualty figures for runners as a specific category were never systematically recorded. They were simply counted as infantry casualties, their particular role absorbed into the aggregate, which is itself a form of institutional erasure we will return to shortly. But battalion war diaries, survivor accounts, and unit records allow historians to reconstruct enough of the picture to understand what runners were facing. During the Battle of the Somme in 1916, some forward units reported losing their entire runner contingent, typically 4 to 6 men per battalion, within the first 48 hours of the offensive. Not their entire unit, their entire runner contingent. Every man assigned specifically to carry messages was killed or wounded before the battle was 2 days old. Replacements were assigned and lost almost as quickly. In the chaos of the opening phase of the Somme, some companies were functionally blind for hours at a time because every man sent to carry a message had been killed before he arrived. During heavy fighting, historians have estimated that runners on some sections of the Western Front had somewhere between 15 and 20% chance of completing any given run without becoming a casualty. 1 in 5 per run. And runs were not once-a-day assignments. During active operations, a runner might be sent out 10, 15, 20 times in a 24-hour period. If you do that mathematics honestly, the survival odds across a full day of heavy fighting approach something close to 0. The British Army's solution to this problem was straightforward and brutal. When a message was critically important, they sent multiple runners with identical copies. Not because they expected all of them to get through, because they expected most of them to be killed, and they needed at least one to survive. Runners knew this. They knew that when command sent 3 men with the same message, it was because command had calculated that 2 of them were going to die. They ran anyway. Here's where the story takes a turn that most people find genuinely startling. Adolf Hitler served as a runner. Yes, that Adolf Hitler. During the First World War, the future dictator of Germany served as a Meldganger, a regimental runner for the 16th Bavarian Reserve Regiment from 1914 through 1918. He ran messages across no man's land repeatedly for nearly 4 years. He was wounded twice. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, a decoration that was exceptionally rare for an enlisted man, and was specifically cited for his conduct as a runner under fire. Even Hitler's own account, and the accounts of the men who served alongside him, described runner duty as among the most dangerous assignments a soldier could draw. His survival for 4 full years in this role was considered extraordinary by the men who knew him. Most of his fellow runners did not survive the war. The men who came in as runners after casualties depleted the pool had life expectancies measured in weeks. Hitler was the exception. The rule was a wooden cross somewhere in the mud of Flanders or the Somme. Think about that for a moment. A man who would go on to start the most destructive war in human history survived the First World War specifically because of the kind of luck that deserted most of the men doing the same job. History turned on runner casualty rates. Now let's talk about what the institution that sent these men out actually gave them. What the men were equipped with. What preparations were made for their survival. Because this is where the story shifts from tragedy to something that starts to feel like institutional negligence on a mass scale. The equipment issued to a World War I runner was identical to the equipment issued to every other infantry soldier. Same uniform, same boots, same helmet. Nothing about the runner's kit acknowledged the specific nature of his assignment or the specific threats he faced. Some runners made their own modifications, stripping off equipment to run faster, trading weight for speed in the hope that the reduced crossing time would offset the reduced protection. The Army neither encouraged nor discouraged this. It simply did not have a policy. The runner as a specific tactical category with specific needs had not been thought through at the institutional level. No special routes were designated or maintained. A runner was typically told his destination and left to find his own way there. He might use the same route that the last 3 runners had used, which meant German snipers and machine gunners had already ranged that ground and knew exactly where the next man would appear. The practice of alternating routes, of providing cover fire for runners, and of timing crossings to coincide with suppressing fire were innovations that individual officers figured out at the battalion level through hard experience. They were not doctrine. They were not taught. They were reinvented, at cost, by unit after unit across the entire Western Front. There was no special pay for runner duty, no additional recognition in the medal system that acknowledged the particular mathematics of the job. The Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor, could be and was awarded to runners, but for specific acts of conspicuous bravery, not for the sustained courage of doing the job at all. A man who ran 20 messages a day for 3 months across no man's land and survived on nothing but speed and luck received the same recognition as a man who sat in a trench and never crossed open ground at all. 0. And here is perhaps the most damning institutional failure of all. Even when better communication technology began to become available, more reliable radio sets, improved telephone equipment, and signal lamps that could work over shorter distances, many senior commanders were slow to adopt them. Not because the technology did not work, but because they trusted it less than they trusted a man on foot. The runner was a known quantity. He had always worked, in the sense that the message usually eventually arrived, even if it took multiple men and multiple deaths to get it there. The new technology required training, maintenance, and a certain institutional willingness to change. While commanders debated the reliability of radio equipment in their comfortable headquarters bunkers, runners continued dying to deliver messages that a functioning radio network could have transmitted in seconds. The men who came home from runner duty, the ones who came home, carried something that the war left in almost everyone who survived it, but in a particular concentrated form. Shell shock, as it was then called, affected a significant proportion of runners. The specific psychological profile of runner duty, the repeated exposure to extreme danger, the individual nature of the assignment, and the absolute absence of the collective protective psychology that men in unit formations could draw on, produced a particular kind of damage. An infantryman going over the top did so with hundreds of other men. The terror was shared. The sensory experience was shared. If he survived, he came back to men who had experienced the same thing, who could understand it without explanation, who could share the particular knowledge of what that ground felt like under their boots. A runner crossed alone. He experienced the terror alone. He arrived at his destination, if he arrived, among men who had not made the crossing, who could see that he was shaking, but could not fully understand why, who needed the message he was carrying, and sent him back out once he had delivered it. The psychological isolation of that role, repeated daily for months, produced men who came back to England unable to explain what had happened to them in terms that the people around them could grasp. The official psychiatric understanding of the time was inadequate to the experience in any case. Shell shock was poorly understood, frequently dismissed, and sometimes criminally mishandled. Men suffering from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder were court-martialed for cowardice, and in some cases executed. Runners were no more protected from this institutional failure than anyone else. There are no monuments specifically to World War I runners. You will not find at the Menin Gate or Thiepval or any of the great memorials of the Western Front a specific acknowledgement of the runner as a role, a category, a class of men who died at a rate that exceeded ordinary infantry and who were essential to every operation the British, French, and German armies ever conducted. They are absorbed into the aggregate, counted as infantry, lost in the general enormous number, forgotten. And here is the final dark irony that the story of World War I runners leaves behind. The technology that made runners unnecessary was developed, funded, and prioritized specifically because runners were dying faster than they could be replaced. The catastrophic communication failures of the Somme, of Passchendaele, of every major Western Front offensive. Failures that were directly caused by the impossibility of maintaining runner-based communication under those conditions drove military investment in radio technology that paid off in time for the Second World War. By 1939, infantry units had access to portable radio equipment that could maintain reliable communication across the distances that had required runners in 1916. By 1944, a company commander could call for artillery support, report his position, and receive orders without sending a single man across open ground. Every radio call a soldier made in the Second World War, every piece of communication that moved electronically rather than on foot, every man who did not have to run a message across no man's land because the wire worked or the radio worked, all of it was paid for in a direct and traceable way by the deaths of men whose names were never separately recorded, whose role was never formally recognized, and whose sacrifice was absorbed into the general catastrophic casualty figures of a war that killed so many people that the arithmetic of individual losses became almost meaningless. They were not killed in charges. They were not killed defending positions. They were killed running pieces of paper from one point to another because the technology to do it any other way did not yet exist, because the institution that sent them did not think carefully enough about protecting them, and because the generals who needed their messages stayed in bunkers and sent men out to die instead. They crossed no man's land alone. They did it again and again and again. When the war ended, the world moved on and forgot they had ever existed. They deserved better than that. The record just does not reflect it.